All right, we are on the last subject, and those are the scientific issues. This to me is a very important subject because this is where most of the attacks on Genesis 1 have come from a non-believing world. And to me, if God is the author of Genesis 1, the ultimate author, and if he is the creator of all science, in other words, all true science is God's science, the two should coincide. That I accept. I would take that from any person. And to me, over the years, fascination has just been the unlocking of just that, how incredibly integrated Genesis 1 is with modern science. You've seen that already this morning. So many ways in which everything that Genesis is saying about creation and its history is backed up by modern science. And I'm going to finish with just one theme here, which is probably, for me, the most dramatic way that science has unwittingly unlocked a pattern in Genesis 1, which you wouldn't notice if you just read it in English, but I'll give it to you. Firstly, the pattern itself is the use of one Hebrew word in Genesis 1 3 times. It only appears on 3 occasions. It's the Hebrew word bara, B-A-R-A. And bara means something gets created out of nothing. It's Parmenides' original thesis that ex nihilo nihilo fit. That means in English, out of nothing, nothing comes, which is true. But this whole universe came out of nothing, and a few other things came out of nothing as well. So we're going to have a look at those, and each one of them here is the only 3 occasions where Genesis 1 uses the word bara to define them. Everything else is asa, haya, different ways of describing developmental progresses, but this one is AD blote. You know, that's what I always say to Blue Bulls supporters. Je weet waar die blou bulle vandaan gekom het? AD blote. Anyway, and that's what it means when we say creation ex nihilo, AD blote, out of nothing. The first one is the origin of the universe. Well, Genesis 1 tells you, in the beginning, meaning origin, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I don't take that to mean God created the heavens and the earth together. It's just a simple definition. God created the heavens I see above me and the earth I know beneath me. That's just a general statement. But it is a beginning. And the amazing thing about science, and it troubles scientists, is that you used to have what was known as the steady state theory. This was followed by a number of scientists, Fred Hoyle and others. And this taught that everything out there in the universe was always there. It didn't have a beginning. It was always there. Today, that steady state theory has been overturned by modern science all over the world. And it is uniformly accepted in scientific circles that this universe had a beginning, and a beginning that it cannot explain. It knows roughly what happened. It's got enough evidence to take it back and say there was a big bang. That's the definition. But that sounds like a bit of a cop-out. You know, how did all this come about through a bam? How do you get so much order out of chaos? Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that because that's crucial here. But the Big Bang is the first thing we're going to deal with. And one thing here, sorry, let me just get where I need to be. Oh yes, I gave you that illustration earlier of a woman baking a cake. If she takes flour and her eggs and her, milk and everything, and then bakes a cake in her oven, that you would be called a nasa process in Hebrew of creation. It comes together. They put them together in an accretion like the sun was. The sun got so much pressure internally that it ignited, not in the same form as you light a fire, but through fusion and things like that. This is defined in Genesis always by the word asa. It's the commonest word for creation in the Old Testament. But bara means something created out of nothing. Meaning, like I said, the woman has got nothing, but she creates the milk, she creates the egg, she creates everything first. Then she makes the cake. And that's what the Big Bang is exactly about. It created a universe effectively out of nothing. In fact, it's a common belief that an infinite, this was one of the famous scientists described it like this, infinitesimally small, infinitely dense, exploded, bam. And my goodness, I'd love to know to this day, I've never heard a scientist give any kind of rational explanation, where from something that was invisibly small, this whole universe was created. There are billions of galaxies, not millions, billions in the universe. So how did all that come about? Through just one little minute explosion. It must have been an explosion of proportions that somehow puffed it up, or whatever it did, who knows. But my conviction is, and this is even coming out, I'm going to quote a famous scientist who confirms this himself, is that we don't really know what happened. We know how the Big Bang happened. We know it was an explosion, but we don't know how it happened. In Genesis 1 verse 1, if you're just reading it through in English, you read these words: in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now, that's the Revised Standard Version. But it uses the word created here, the RSV. It's going to go on to only use that word created again, twice more. That's all. And it's using it carefully in the context, because every time it's the translation of the word bara. It's telling you that this is a creation effectively out of nothing. And it wasn't just one, there's three. And we're going to come to all three of them. And science acknowledges it. And these are the things science has trouble with. Has trouble with the Big Bang, trying to explain it. They uniformly agreed that the Big Bang was effectively out of nothing. But the two major factors that have convinced scientists that it must have happened that way, the one is the Hubble factor, that it is known scientists discovered, Hubble and them did, through telescopes, that the further out you go in the universe, the more the universe is expanding outward. There's so much red light coming from the galaxies that are further away, that not so much close to us. Close, the light is usually sort of whitish or even bluish. But from that distance, they're coming red, meaning that the whatever we're looking at is moving away. And the slowest wavelength form in color is coming in our direction. So that's the first one. And they found that that is uniformly so right across the whole universe. What we cannot tell is where it began. We haven't got a clue where it began. We only know where it's gone and where it is today. And the other thing, the second thing that confirmed it, is called the cosmic microwave background. And that is a kind of hiss. You had some guys years ago called in America, Penzias and Wilson, were looking at something on a screen that they had, and suddenly this fuzzy-wuzzy stuff came all over the screen. Sometimes if you look at your TV, you might suddenly get that, where it switches off, but there's still light there. Brrr, you get these what look like wavelengths. And this is exactly what they were looking at. And they couldn't tell what it was. But they found, the more they tried to get around it, to get rid of it, that it was everywhere, absolutely everywhere. The next thing they found was that it had a temperature, very low one, 2.72 degrees Kelvin, below Kelvin. That's only 0.03 above absolute freezing. So they said, now what is this? And then another couple of guys called Dick and Peebles, who discovered this CMB, they said, there must be something surviving from the Big Bang heat, because if there was a Big Bang, the distance, the way in which it dissipated, the entropy of that initial explosion, there should still be some effect of it left. And when they heard what Penzias and Wilson were looking for, they got together and they said, this is it, we found it. And they call it the cosmic microwave background. They know the temperature of it. They know it's uniform throughout the universe. It's the last minute remaining effect of the Big Bang on the universe at large. Now, here's where the difficulty comes in. You would expect from an explosion, if you see an explosion anyway, if you see an airplane, if you ever watch air crash investigations, Plane goes down, hits the ground, and of course the petrol explodes. Bam! And there's a massive explosion, fire and smoke and everything everywhere. And by the time they put it out, there's nothing you can use in an airplane again. It's totally destroyed. Now that's what should have happened if the Big Bang was what people think it was. Just an explosion of something small, just exploded like a bam. But within less than a second, it was creating atoms, it was creating protons, neutrons, electrons, and on top of that, all the physical laws of the universe. The four major forces came with it: the gravitational force, strong and weak nuclear, and the other one is, I can't think immediately. All of them came from the Big Bang. They had to be there at the beginning. So how did something that was just a random, uncontrolled, chaotic explosion bring all these things into uniform stability and interrelationship almost immediately? They cannot explain that. They can only accept it. And this is what we see today. They've come up like Stephen Hawking did. He came up with a really novel idea, the multiverse theory. How many of you know things about the multiverse theory? Not much. Multiverse theory means this. You know why this universe is so stable? Because it's locked in by other universes. There's another one up there somewhere, there's one over there, and the gravitational forces and everything else are keeping this universe stable. Well, the fact is this universe is anything but stable. It's expanding all the time, and it's not finding any other universes. Or it doesn't do much in our lifetimes. But through the history of it, they're not finding anything that they are looking for. This is Stephen Hawking. He said, our universe and its laws appear to have a design that is both tailor-made to support us and, if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. That is not easily explained and raises the natural question of why it is that way. That's a pretty bold concession by Stephen Hawking, but he knows. That's all we know about the Big Bang. We know certain things about it to be sure that the origin of the universe was the Big Bang, but we don't know how. We don't know what happened. Today, and Stephen Hawking points this out, he says, if the gravitational force, if the power of it was 0.0, something like this, 0.0000001 more than it is, the universe would have expanded into a chaotic universe, just expanded. If it was 0.00001 less than it is, it would have all contracted into not a big bang, a big crunch. It would have all come together again and crunched itself. And I listened to that and I thought, boy, those are fine margins. That's like saying that, don't go on the Titanic, because the Titanic is not on a, never mind, the new Titanic doesn't have a broad keel to keep it on the water. It's got a razor thinner than your razor, and that's what it's using as its keel. And if you just scratch a bit of paint off on the one side, the ship's going to fall over. Well, that doesn't even begin to describe the fine-tuning of our universe. And this is something that is causing scientists a tremendous amount of difficulty. And I looked at this, and I've said it in my book. I said, if you're saying, if there was 0.0001 less or 0.001 more, it would go one way or the other. What does it do if it's 0.00000? That's what it does. That's what this universe does. We are living in a universe which has a perfect interaction. It's not imperfect, it's not imbalanced. The whole universe is balanced, not through just all of the stars and whatever that are there, but balanced in terms of the four forces, the nuclear, strong and weak, and the others, gravitational. They are so integrated with each other. They are in fact, from quantum physics today, this is coming out more than ever. Everything seems to be interrelating with everything else in a way you can't describe. You'd think somebody would say, it's not something which we should be looking for. It's someone. Someone who has a greater authority and power than anything in this universe, who planned it all out and put it into effect. But of course they don't like that, because then you're on religion. And they don't want to bring religion into science. But I can tell you, if you don't bring it in, you're going to be left with some very awkward questions to answer. One of the best-known Christian scholars who's tackled the Big Bang is William Lane Craig. He's an American, very good apologist, and he calls it his Kalam principle. And his principle is simply this, and he's got all of these guys on the back foot. So one chap, I think it was Jonathan Pierce, wrote a whole book to try and respond to Craig, and just couldn't get around this one point Craig keeps making. He says, if there was something there at the beginning, but it was there, to have exploded, something had to cause the explosion. What was it? It means we not only have got something there, but we've got to have a cause as well. We've got to have two things there to bring this into being. And even Pierce, I know in one of his books, he says, I suppose, he just gives it away. He says, I suppose it could have happened that way, yes. But he doesn't acknowledge that there's probably no other way it could have happened, because something had to cause it, to cause the thing to explode. I'll come back shortly to that. The solution, in my view, possibly, this is just a guess. I mean, I'm no authoritative scientist. I'm just guessing. If God created the universe, something was coming into being, which in the shortest zillionth of a second, quadrillionth or whatever of a split portion of a second, was just inevitably exploded. Yeah, it was an outburst, not in the sense of being an explosion, but just a burst outwards. Something that was coming into being, whatever it was, did this, boom, and just shot everywhere and created the universe we're in. Only a creator could have done that. Only a divine creator, only someone could have brought that into being. There's no one else. In other words, the Big Bang itself is the origin of the universe, because what was coming into being was too volatile. And by volatile, I don't mean it was unstable. I mean it was just unsustainable. And it exploded in a way that it uniformly, in a moment, spread everything everywhere and created the universe as it is today. And that was the whole purpose of its design. The Lord just said, let there be, and as he's saying it, boom, it happens. It can't sustain itself. Now, the particular scientist that I'm thinking of is Sir Roger Penrose. Anybody ever heard of him? He's a British scientist. He's probably the top scientist in the world since Stephen Hawking passed away a few years ago. He's certainly today the Professor, Dr. Sir Roger Penrose. Those are his full names. But he's a very likable guy. And he's not a Christian, but he is so honest in his thinking. He just isn't one of these, scientists who wants moving all the way in one direction and everything's got to fit that way. He's not like that at all. If he sees a problem, he just identifies it. I've got 3 of his books, The Road to Reality, others, Fine-Tuning and what have you. They're thick books, and tell you, I can't understand 90% of those books. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. When they get on to quantum physics, I'm totally lost. But all 3 books have been invaluable to me because he does the same thing in every book. He tackles the entropy factor, second law of thermodynamics. And his theme is this. He says, there was an explosion, it should have been random, it should have been uncontrolled, it should have just been chaotic, and because it is an explosion, bam, with an incredible energy, but it splits so quickly, the energy's gone in a moment. He said there should have been a high entropy immediately, like an airplane crashing. Bam! In a moment it explodes, and in less than a few seconds, everything, high entropy, boom, gone. Everything's no longer what it was. It's just the fire dissipates and you can't bring it back to what it was. So he's worried about this. He keeps saying there should have been a very high entropy. He said, but from what he can see, the entropy was very low. He says, and that's a gross understatement. He said, because what we find is that this whole universe is so finely tuned, like I just showed you, like Stephen Hawking admits, that the force of gravity is so perfectly tuned that a slight slip one way or the other and it's going to go all over the place. But somehow it's perfectly balanced right in the middle. And this is what Penrose says. It doesn't make sense. Should never have been like that. We know it was a bang of an explosion. But if it was, it should have had high entropy. It should have just collapsed everything. It should have just chaotically dissipated energy and everything in all directions, and we wouldn't be what it is here today. But what we know from the Big Bang, and I've got definitions now, which change it from an aeroplane that hits the ground, bam, and explodes, to another aeroplane. It comes flying along. It's going at about 600 k's an hour. Comes down, it sees a piece of flat land, it lands there, turns around, parks, somebody fills it up, turn the engines on again, and it just graciously takes its way up into the sky and it goes. Why can it do that when the other airplane couldn't even stop itself from exploding? The reason is because a designer has designed the aircraft and has put the energy creation in the engines under strict control, as perfectly controlled as possible, to make air traffic very, very safe. And that's obviously what happened at the time. I put it like this. When you talk about a random explosion, I said change that to ordered and constructed. How you can have that, I don't know, but that's what it was. It was an ordered explosion, and it was a constructed one. No longer chaotic, cosmological, interreacting, uniformly fitting perfectly together. And when they talk about discordant simplicity, I change that to harmonious complexity. That's what it was. The Big Bang somehow was a controlled, ordered event, like an airplane landing and taking off again, without dissipating the energy. In fact, in one of his books, Penrose has a section headed, "The Phenomenal Precision of the Big Bang." And I'll read this to you. Penrose says, "The cosmic microwave background evidence seems to be telling us that the macroscopic status of the Big Bang had enormous entropy, even equal to the maximum among all possibilities. So what is it that has gone so seriously wrong?" Now, I've quoted this in my book, and I said, look, buddy, nothing's gone wrong. Everything went perfectly right. That's what it is. That's why we're here today. That's why this universe is so stable. It's volatile, but it's stable to an nth degree. And that can only be if you read this, Isaiah 45:18. "He created the heavens, he is God, who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create a chaos. He formed it to be inhabited." There's your definition. There's the best definition of a Big Bang anywhere. And the Lord speaks himself in the very next voice and says, "I did not speak in a land of darkness. I did not say to the offspring of Jacob, seek me in chaos." That's scripture for you. That's the Lord just defining his own amazing way in which he brought the Big Bang into being. And I want you to notice, this is the key thing here. This is one of the only 3 occasions that Genesis uses the word bara, creating something out of nothing. Nothing meaning nothing that could have brought it into being by itself. And number 1, Genesis 1 does it at the beginning, and there it is, Big Bang, and they're battling to explain it. Everything in one sentence that Genesis 1 says has driven every scientist to have to come to terms with that somehow in terms of the origin of our universe. That's amazing. All right, now we go to the second occasion. Now we're going to move on now to day 5 in this, because the word bara doesn't come again until day 5. And it's here, Genesis 1 verse 21. "So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds." Now that's interesting, because it's the second time that Genesis uses the word bara to describe something that was created. This means the Big Bang was a creation, but now comes a totally new creation out of nothing somewhere back there in history. That's what it's telling you. When he created the sea monsters, meaning what became sea monsters today, because day 5 is always talking about the present time. And something happened 540 million years ago. This time it's the paleontologists that have an endless amount of difficulty. Scientists struggle every day with the Big Bang. Now all paleontologists are struggling with something that happened 540 million years ago. And it also came, boom, out of nothing. And it's what Ronnie mentioned, the Cambrian explosion. How many of you know anything about the Cambrian explosion? Okay. There's a little creature here on the front, which I showed you. Well, what happened is this. Way back 200 years ago, scientists began and paleontologists started finding fossils of funny-looking animals, all things like crustaceans, arthropods, and things, trilobites were there, and they started finding them in places where you could date them back to 540 million years ago, but no further. And everything they were finding just wouldn't go further back than that age. Now that wasn't known today as well as it is, but Darwin knew this. Charles Darwin knew the Cambrian explosion. He knew it. And his way of explaining it, when people said, but hang on, Charles, you say that everything comes by evolution, by natural selection. Well, this couldn't have happened by natural selection. There's no selection at all. This thing just comes into being. All these creatures, funny little creatures about this size, probably no bigger than this size, in the oceans that were filling the oceans. And the biggest problem for paleontologists is this, that it's not just that they were new creatures, but they were the first ever multi-celled creatures that came into being. That's what we are. We are multi-celled. We have 2 eyes in the head. We have teeth. We have, everything serving different functions. That's what a multi-celled creature is. Prior to that, single-celled organisms have been known since 3.8 billion years ago, that far back. And that was algae, that's bacteria, prokaryotic bacteria. But eukaryotic animals, multi-celled animals, go back to this event. Something happened there that suddenly brought, boom, all these creatures into being. They had eyes, as you can see here. They had limbs. They had, tongues. They had just about everything we've got today. And the interesting thing is that what is there today is no different to what was there then. We had today the same creatures. If you have a look at us, we're all multi-celled creatures, and we haven't changed. These creatures had eyes in their forehead to give them forward vision, and more than one to give them more controlled vision. As you know, if you drive with only one eye open, it's very difficult to do. 2 eyes make everything different. And right back there at the Cambrian, they had sometimes 5 eyes and other things, like horseshoe crabs have got 4 eyes, but it's still the same thing all the time. It's these multi-celled creatures, and there were 60 phyla or phyla structure that we would know from that time. 60 of them, different types, different shapes, like you've got birds, and then you've got animals, and then you've got trilobites, and then you've got tortoises and whatever they are. All of these, there were 60 different phyla at that time. And it's down today to 35. 25 of them are gone extinct. But there are virtually no phyla. Nothing else has changed. It was a single miraculous event that brought all of these sea creatures into being. Charles Darwin said, no. He says, the only reason why we can't find out, where all this came from is we haven't got enough fossils. This is what me, as a lawyer, can tell you. It's what we call argumentum ad silentem, an argument from silence. And we regard in law, these are the weakest kind of arguments to defend anything. It could have happened like this, or maybe that you haven't, and so on. Arguments from silence, and that's what Darwin was saying. Unfortunately, we're stuck with the silence. We haven't got enough fossils. They must surely be there. And Richard Dawkins, who's the number one propagator of, everything goes by natural selection, he said the same. That was his explanation. Well, since then, sure, we have discovered a lot more, a huge amount more. All it's done is increase our knowledge of what happened when this explosion came in marine life, and we can't take it further. We're no better off than Darwin was. We got all the fossils we need now. The Burgess Shale up in northern Canada. What is the other one called? The other one doesn't have a name. Zhenjiang guy called Zhenjiang found it in the Kunming province in China, up in the Liaoning area of northern China, where they found unbelievable fossils of just about everything, the origin of birds, 300 species of Microraptor, I can go on. I think 1,000 fossilized Confuciusornis birds going back to the dinosaur age and so on. And in all this, Namibia, elsewhere, we've got far more than they ever had then. But nothing changes. It still leaves us constantly with the same thing. And that is that 540 odd million years ago, and they've taken it down to 10 million years, which is only a moment in any kind of evolutionary advancement. And in that short period of time, 4 different types, 4 different species came. Only one has disappeared, and those are the trilobites. But even they, I've got some trilobites at home. I've got one with eyes, which are called schizochroal, hexachroal. They had so many different types of eyes. And if you look at this little guy, he's about 300 million years old. And he's in limestone. He's not preserved in shale, which most of them are. And therefore, he's got all his features together. And you look at this, they had more complex eyes than any creature in the world today. And that was at the beginning. There was nothing before them. And suddenly they all arrived, not only with eyes, but complex eyes. These little, you want to just see the shape. You can actually see this crisscross shape in the eye frame of their complexity. And it just made it very, very difficult for anyone to understand how it happened. The trilobites are gone, but we know of 15,000 different species that existed at one time or another. That was from 540 million until the Permian extinction, which is 250 million years ago. Trilobites went extinct. But we've got 15,000. Some of them are about this size. If you go to the Natural History Museum in Washington, you walk in the front door and they've got a whole area put aside for trilobite fossils. Fascinating to look at. And you've got others, I've got 1 or 2 at home, which can only be measured in millimeters. And yet they all went, the whole lot were gone with the Permian extinction. Permian extinction wiped out 96% of all life on Earth. It was the biggest catastrophic extinction ever known. And yet the funny thing is, within no time, the Triassic Age came and there were dinosaurs everywhere. I won't go into that. I could give a talk on that, but I won't. We'll get off the track. But that's the only one that's disappeared. The rest of them are all here. Horseshoe crabs and things, all are similar to those creatures that were there at the time of the Cambrian explosion, the Cambrian era. That's why it's called that. The fascinating thing is that this is exactly what Genesis defines in 1 verse 20. So God created, bara, the sea creatures. When there were no sea creatures, no multicelled creatures of any form before them. And they all came into being almost at once. And Genesis 1, this is only the second time that Genesis 1 says something came into being virtually out of nothing, the sea creatures. And where Genesis 1 carefully chooses the word bara. And this is exactly what paleontologists have found. Just as the scientists struggle to explain the Big Bang, they can't explain the Cambrian explosion. I'd love to have a chat to Richard Dawkins and put this quote of mine on that he said back in his face. For example, he said, the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them in an advanced state of evolution. How does he know that? He doesn't. He's just finding them as something new. But anyway, he says in an advanced state of evolution, the very first time they appear. They just come out of nothing and they're there. He says it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. I'd love to just have a word with him about that quote. Because he's giving the game away. He's conceding the whole point. Cambrian explosion is inexplicable. They just came out of nothing. Thousands of them. They found thousands of fossils of thousands of creatures going back to the Cambrian explosion. And they just cannot explain how this, like the Big Bang, how this burst of marine life over a 10 million year period just came, and everything today is clearly evolved and descended from it. From that, 540 came about 420 in the Devonian age, where your first probably lobe-finned fish, we don't know for sure, came onto the land. Then your tetrapods, from that came the dinosaurs. From the dinosaurs came the dino birds, as I call them. Those are the bird life, oldest dino birds known. They're half bird, half dinosaur. You can't deny that. Boy, just look at them, you can see it. And they can go back to about 160 million years ago. But right where we are today, we look back there and nothing preceded the Cambrian explosion. But everything that came in its phyletic structure, its basic structures, remains today with every hard skeleton creature on this planet. Now the last one. Genesis 1:27 says this. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This time is the last time that Genesis 1 uses the word bara. And when it talks about Adam and Eve, it's telling you they came about through the same method. Created out of nothing, the dust of the ground. You cannot create any kind of animal just out of dust. But that's what Genesis 1 says God did. Adam and Eve, Genesis 1 is crystal clear that the creation of Adam and Eve was a separate, independent, physical creation, anything up to 6,000 or 8,000 years ago. And if you have a look here, this to me is where the interest comes in, is that we know today, it's scientifically proven, no matter what anyone wants to think about it, but we know that human species have lived on this earth for about 3 million years. You go back to the various different Homo species all over the world have been discovered, and Homo habilis, then Homo ergaster, then Homo sapiens, and then us today. And it looks like we are, descendants of the hominids, because there were Homo sapiens species. The hominids were there. We know that. They go back about 300,000 years. Whereas with us, we only go back about 6,000 years, or 8, as we know the human race as it is today. But Genesis 1, this time, takes the ball right into its own hands. And 3 times it uses the word bara to emphasize the creation of Adam and Eve. Not once. Only once does it use that word for the Big Bang, once for the Cambrian explosion, and this time 3 times. God created bara, man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, bara. Male and female, he created them, bara. Clear as daylight. Now, I've got a friend of mine who's an accountant. He's a very popular one. He goes all over the world. And I did his father's estate. And he and I become very good friends. We have lunch when he comes out here from England. We get together. We were just having lunch at a restaurant here one day, and he's not a Christian, not by any description, although he admits, he says, I don't believe that everything here just, came out of an evolutionary process. Either God created it, or there must be some other explanation, and that's what he's looking for, and not finding it. But anyway, he made a comment to me. He said, in England, and you read all the books of science and things, he says, everything makes sense except 8,000 years ago. Now, this is coming from somebody, not a Christian at all. He says 8,000 years ago, the human species was transformed phenomenally. And what he is meaning is this. Genesis 1 says it. God created a new human species in his image and named him Adam. The new species, that's what all you and I are. We can do these things that no hominid can do and no other creature has ever been able to do. We can plan. We can sit down, think into the future, work out our holiday, days ahead, everything. make provision for possible weather changes, and we can do it deliberately in a way that no other creature can do it. We've created a world of our own. We're sitting here today. All I see is a world we've created. This is a big building. Everything in here is man-made. But it's a world that is suited to us. And no other creature has ever been able to do that, or is certainly not on this kind of scale. We can communicate through speech. We can talk to people. We can talk in different languages. We can convey the most profound ideas, everything, just through the ability to speak. We have a voice box that makes that possible, which other creatures, many don't have. But we are quite capable of communicating through speech. And also, we have a terrible consciousness of the difference between good and evil. And that no other creature has. There's not a creature out there that thinks to itself. No leopard looks at an impala and says, I'm hungry, but shame, I feel sorry for it. I'll leave it alone. Don't ever think that a leopard looks at you and says, nice looking guy, hi. You see one, get out of its way. If it's hungry, get out of its way. Yeah, but that's what we have. We have this conscience, which no other creature has. Good and evil. And lastly, we are highly religious by nature. We worship things we don't see. We can't see them. Some people make idols and images so they've got something to see. But one way or another, this human species is irresistibly religious, incurably religious. All over the world, you go to the Mayan areas of Mexico and South America, go to Machu Picchu, and you see everywhere people, where they had settlements, they had some form of religious significance. They constantly turned towards spirit beings that they couldn't see. What has made this human species so aware of spirit beings beyond themselves? We do. We all believe them. Angels, demons, Holy Spirit himself, invisible, but there. And that's what they are. And this is how Genesis distinguishes this creature, man made in the image of God, from all pre-existing hominids. When God dismissed Cain, he said, Cain replied to him after he killed Abel, Genesis 4:14, you have driven me this day away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will slay me. And God says to him, not so. If anyone slays Cain, vengeance will be taken upon him sevenfold. And I'm sitting here, and Christians have always said, no, who are they talking about? Who are these people out there? Not in the Garden of Eden, but out there. That if Cain goes out there, he's going to walk into human populations. And they may not like him. Don't blame them for that. And might kill him. Next thing, you start reading about Cain's wife. I mean, even as a kid, I always knew that expression. Where did Cain get his wife from? You know, it was only Adam, Eve, and Cain at that stage. Where did Cain's wife come from? Well, there's a hint in the very description, because it talks about Cain's wife and doesn't name her, whereas all of the Seth descendants, Lamech and others, their wives are named. The descendants of Adam and Eve through Seth are all named. But through Cain, the wife he had was obviously a hominid woman. And it makes it so much easier, like even in Genesis 6, when it says the sons of God looked on the daughters of men and saw that they were fair and took to wife of them whoever they chose. Now what's wrong with that? God said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. It says they took them to wife. I mean, crumbs, in our society today, that's the done thing. So why does God say, my spirit will not sit with man any longer. I'm going to destroy him and wipe him off the face of the earth. What did they do wrong? It can only have been one thing. Sons of God, men descended from Adam through Seth, looked, and others, and perhaps even Cain, looked on the daughters of men, not the daughters of God, looked on hominid women and took wife of them whom they chose. And God says, now my offspring are becoming nothing but flesh. I will destroy them from the face of the earth. 3 times in Genesis 1, 3 times, the emphasis is there so that people will know, certainly believing people, outside people may not accept this, but that believing Christians may know that we are not descended from hominids. We were created in the image of God as a singular, new act of creation from the dust of the ground. Lastly, and now I come to the most important thing. Lastly, how does this all fit together with Genesis 1 in relation to what we know about science? Well, the word bara is used 3 times for 3 unique creations in this world. And they are the same 3 that science and even everything else cannot explain. They cannot explain the complexity of this human species. They cannot explain the advent of so many marine species, and they cannot explain the Big Bang. And those are the very 3 things that Genesis 1 uses the word bara to define. A perfect harmony between Scripture and science. I'm going to leave it there. Any questions? Yes. Archaeopteryx, yes. Yeah. Interesting. Until the middle of the 19th century, all birds looked the same to us. They had the same phyletic structure and everything. They had beaks, and they had normal flesh, and they had feathers, and so on. And then suddenly, in the Solnhofen area of Germany, they discovered a fossil of what is obviously a bird, but it was also showed every dinosaur feature as well. And the dinosaur features were these. The bird had teeth, it had a jaw, and it had a reptilian kind of skin. But to every other respect, it had wings, it had this, it had that, it had claws. It was a bird. And they eventually discovered about a dozen of them. And at the time, they just thought this was a unique discovery. Until more recent times, and when I say recent, I mean it, last 40, 50 years, where they've since discovered, especially up in the Liaoning area of China, phenomenal number of bird species, going back to about 80, 100, 120, as far back as we can go to 150 million years, 160 million years ago. Before that, we cannot trace any avian species. But Archaeopteryx goes back 150 million years. Since then, they've discovered Anchiornis, he goes 160, and they've found so many others. And they're all the same. They look half dinosaur, half bird. They've got every avian feature, but then they've got jaws and everything. In fact, only one bird species in all these of the, I just know this subject well because I'm a bird lover. Anybody who knows me, interested in birds. But your enantiorniths and all the other different species, the Hesperonians and what they are, all those different bird species that existed at that time, all had jaws with teeth. Only one didn't. And he was called Confuciusornis. I don't think that means he was confused about his beak, but whatever it does. That bird looked just like one of ours. 2 of them, male and female. And at Liaoning, they found 1,000 species of Confuciusornis. And sometimes, and you can see it, I did a folder on this, you can actually see the male with 2 long-tailed streamers and a female with none. And that goes for your long-tailed widow and all sorts of birds, resplendent quetzal to this day. The male got a long tail and the female hasn't. But these things are going back to 150 million years ago. And it's just showing what the evolution of birds was. Only Confuciusornis had a beak, no jaws. After the Alvarez event, where probably a meteorite hit the earth in the Yucatan area and wiped out the dinosaurs, it wiped out the dino birds as well, wiped every one of them out, and then there are none left to this day. All birds today have got beaks. There's no bird that's got a jaw with teeth. Funnily enough, a lot of those birds that were there then, by the late years, around 70 million years ago, some of them are very similar to our moorhens and birds today. And they all had beaks before the Alvarez event. They survived it. We don't know how this happened. The birds that had beaks and that are similar to ours today survived that terrible crash, whereas the dino birds were wiped out entirely. And the difficulty with the dino birds, you ask yourself, I thought to myself one day, I thought, Darwin and Dawkins always said, we haven't got enough fossils. I thought, well, you got them now, boy, that's for sure. And you can cover every single 10 million year period with these creatures. We got them back. If you ever want to, I'll show you my bird field guide on the birds of those days. Like the Cecil Field Guide, but this one goes back 150 million years. And it shows all these birds. And the amazing thing about them is just that they're so much similar to where ours are today. But we today don't have any understanding, why some of the other birds survived and they didn't. Archaeopteryx goes back, all of those ones they found were about 150 million years ago. But I've said to myself, why haven't people like Richard Dawkins fastened onto this plethora of fossils they've got that is filling every gap from 160 million to 65 million years ago? Every 10 millions of years, your 30-odd species should be able now to put your, evolutionary theory into effect. Well, I can see the evolution of them. I've put them in my folder and showed that there's a definite evolution from things like Velociraptor, which was a dinosaur, to what birds are today. But one problem is the timing. The timing. This is why Dawkins and others are shutting up. Anchiornis existed 160 million years ago. It's the oldest known fossil of a bird. But it's at stage 4. You've got 5 stages from dinosaur to bird. They're at stage 4. Archaeopteryx 4.5. Just as close to being a bird alone and not something else. But then you find others which are still primitive, and they are only 70 million years old. So you've got a total chaos. I mean, all the books written on this say that. The timing of it doesn't work. They're going from the complex to the simple half the time, as opposed to the simple to the complex. And they cannot explain, as we can't explain tetrapod evolution. We're not sure of that. We think we know it. And we can't explain avian evolution. There's so many things we just don't know. And that's where Archaeopteryx comes in. He's part of that whole phenomenal group of birds that existed 150-odd million years ago. Anyone else? All right, folk. Thank you very much.